The wind rustled through the trees as I walked away from the house, the air biting at my skin. I didn't feel the cold, though. My mind was too busy, a chaotic mess of thoughts and emotions swirling together. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, my feet dragging along the cracked pavement as if some unseen force was pulling me back, demanding that I confront the situation head-on. But I couldn't. Not yet. Not now. I found myself wandering down streets I had walked hundreds of times before. The familiar houses and sidewalks blurred together, but in that moment they felt foreign, distant, as if I was walking through a place I no longer belonged to. My life, my entire world, had been turned upside down in the span of a few minutes. Everything I had known, everything I had built, was now crumbling around me, and I had no idea how to stop it. I eventually came to a park, the one Mia and I used to visit on weekends when we first moved to the neighborhood. It had been one of our favorite spots, a place where we could escape from the pressures of daily life and just be together. We'd sit on the bench by the lake, talking about everything and nothing, dreaming about the future we'd build together. I stopped in front of that very bench now, staring at it as memories of those early days flooded my mind. How happy we had been, how full of hope. I sat down slowly, the old wooden plank creaking beneath my weight, and let my head fall into my hands. The cold reality of what I'd witnessed tonight refused to leave me. No matter how much I tried to push it away, it lingered like a shadow at the edges of my vision. I don't know how long I sat there, staring blankly at the lake in front of me. Time seemed to lose all meaning as I replayed the events in my head over and over. The sight of Mia, her laughter, her smile, everything about that moment felt like a betrayal. She had always been my rock, the one constant in my life. We had our ups and downs like any couple, but I had never doubted her loyalty. Not until tonight. The man's face, his voice, it all seemed like a blur now. In that instant, I realized how little I actually cared about him. He was just a symptom, not the cause of the problem. The real pain, the real heartbreak, came from Mia. She was the one who had broken our bond, the one who had decided to let someone else into our world. And no matter how much I wanted to pretend that it could be undone, I knew it couldn't. I tried to think back, to piece together the moments where things had started to go wrong. Had there been signs, little things I had ignored or brushed off as unimportant? I thought of the late nights she'd spent working, the sudden weekend trips to visit old friends that had seemed so out of character. I had always trusted her explanations, never questioning them, because after all, we had always been honest with each other, or so I thought. My phone buzzed in my pocket, dragging me out of my thoughts. I pulled it out, half expecting to see a message from Mia, but it wasn't her. It was a notification from work, a reminder of an upcoming deadline. I stared at the screen for a moment before tossing the phone onto the bench beside me. Work was the last thing I cared about right now. How could I possibly focus on deadlines and projects when my life was falling apart? As I sat there, the park slowly began to empty out. Families with their children headed home for dinner, couples strolled hand in hand, and joggers finished their evening runs. I watched them all, wondering how many of them were carrying secrets like the one Mia had kept from me. How many of them were hiding their true selves behind smiles and small talk, pretending that everything was fine. Eventually, the park grew quiet. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The loneliness I felt now was palpable, like a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I had always considered myself a strong person, capable of handling whatever life threw at me. But this was different. This was a kind of hurt I had never experienced before, and I had no idea how to deal with it. The thought of going home, of facing Mia and whatever weak explanation she had prepared, made my stomach turn. I wasn't ready for that conversation. Not yet, maybe not ever. I needed more time to process, to think, to figure out what came next. But no matter how much time I took, I knew one thing for sure. Nothing would ever be the same between us. That part of our lives was over, and there was no going back. Hours must have passed by the time I finally stood up from the bench. The sky was dark now, stars flickering faintly above, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the ground. My phone buzzed again, and this time it was Mia. I didn't read the message. I didn't need to. Whatever she had to say would only make things worse. I started walking again, this time with no real destination in mind. My feet carried me through the empty streets, past houses with lights glowing warmly from the inside. It all felt so distant, like I was walking through a dream, or maybe it was a nightmare. Either way, I couldn't seem to wake up. Eventually, I found myself back at the house. The lights were off, and the street was quiet. I stood outside for a moment, staring at the front door. My home, or at least it had been. Now it felt like a stranger's house, a place that no longer belonged to me. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, The air was still heavy with the weight of everything that had happened earlier. I didn't bother turning on the lights. The darkness felt appropriate. I made my way to the living room and sank down onto the couch, the exhaustion finally catching up to me. I heard footsteps on the stairs, and a moment later, Mia appeared in the doorway. She stood there, her eyes red and puffy from crying, her hands wringing nervously. For a long time, we just stared at each other, the silence between us thick and oppressive. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't respond. What was there to say? Sorry didn't even begin to cover what had happened. She took a step closer, her eyes pleading, but I shook my head. "Don't," I said quietly, my voice strained. "Just don't." She hesitated, then nodded, her face crumpling as she turned and disappeared back upstairs. I sat there, alone in the darkness, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. My mind was numb, too tired to think, too drained to feel. Eventually, I closed my eyes, letting the exhaustion take over, and for the first time since it all began, I allowed myself to drift off into a restless sleep. But even in sleep, there was no escape. The images of that night played over and over in my mind, haunting me, refusing to let me forget. When I woke up the next morning, the house was empty. Mia was gone, her things packed up, and a note left on the kitchen table. I didn't read it. There was no point. Whatever she had to say, it wouldn't change anything. And so I stood there, staring at the empty space where her things used to be. The silence of the house deafening. This was my new reality. A reality where the woman I had loved, the woman I had trusted, was no longer a part of my life. And the worst part, I had no idea where to go from here.